Emma Carter traveled 6 days through the Rocky Mountains, expecting to find her brother waiting at the cabin. Instead, smoke rose from the chimney. Someone was already living there. The journey had been longer than she imagined. Each morning she woke before sunrise, packed her belongings onto her horse, and continued westward along trails that grew narrower with every mile. The towns disappeared first, then the ranches. Eventually, even the scattered homesteads vanished behind her, leaving only endless forests, rivers swollen by spring runoff, and mountains that seemed to scrape the sky itself. By the 6th day, Emma felt as though she had crossed into another world entirely. The silence out here was different from the silence she had known back east. It had weight to it, presence, the kind of quiet that made a person realize how much noise they had been carrying without knowing it. The letter remained folded inside her coat pocket. She had read it so many times that the paper had become soft along the creases. Every word was burned into her memory. Daniel Carter is dead. Even now the sentence felt impossible. Her brother had always seemed larger than life. 15 years older than her, he had been the one constant in a world that had taken almost everything else. When their parents died, Daniel became family, protector, and friend all at once. Years later, when he chose to leave civilization behind and settle in a remote mountain valley, Emma had protested loudly and at length. He had only laughed and promised to write, and he had. Every few months another letter arrived, describing the life he was building among the mountains. He wrote about the river that ran through the valley, about the elk that wandered through the forests at dawn, and about the cabin he built with his own hands. His letters always carried a quiet happiness that seemed impossible to find anywhere else. One day you should come see it for yourself. He ended nearly every letter the same way. Emma had always assumed there would be time. Now there wasn't. Late that afternoon, she reached the final mountain pass. The trail climbed steeply through pine trees before emerging onto a rocky overlook. There she pulled her horse to a stop and stared across the valley below. For several moments she forgot her grief entirely. The place was beautiful in a way that made the chest ache. Snow-covered peaks surrounded a broad valley filled with spring sunlight. A river wound through the center like a ribbon of silver. Patches of green grass had begun appearing where winter snow had finally retreated. Thin columns of smoke rose from a handful of distant cabins scattered across the landscape. Daniel had described it countless times in his letters. His descriptions had never been enough. She sat quietly in the saddle, imagining the first day her brother must have seen this place. For the first time, she understood why he stayed. The trail descended slowly toward the valley floor. By the time she finally spotted the cabin through the pines, the afternoon sun was already beginning its descent toward the western peaks. At first, she simply felt relief, then confusion. A thin stream of smoke drifted upward from the chimney. Freshly cut firewood stood stacked beside the wall. A section of fencing had recently been repaired with new timber that still showed pale against the weathered wood around it. The roof appeared solid despite the brutal winter the valley had endured. Someone was taking care of the place. The realization made her uneasy in a way she couldn't immediately name. She dismounted near the front porch and tied her horse to the rail. The valley seemed strangely quiet. Only the sound of moving water and distant birds disturbed the silence. For a moment she considered turning around and seeking out one of the neighboring settlers first. Instead, she walked directly to the door and knocked twice. Nothing happened. She waited. Then she knocked again. This time she heard movement inside. Heavy footsteps crossed the floor. The latch lifted. The door opened. The man standing in the doorway was not what she expected. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, tall, broad-shouldered, strong in the way men became after years of physical labor rather than deliberate exercise. His dark hair had begun showing faint traces of gray near the temples. A short beard framed a weathered face marked by sun, wind, and long winters spent outdoors. He looked at her for several seconds. Not hostile, not welcoming either, simply cautious. The kind of look that belonged to a man who had learned to measure situations carefully before committing to anything. You must be Emma Carter. His voice was calm and unexpectedly gentle. Emma immediately stiffened. "How do you know my name? Daniel talked about you." Hearing her brother's name spoken by a stranger sent a strange feeling through her chest. She looked past him into the cabin. A rifle leaned against the wall beside the fireplace. A coat hung near the door. A kettle rested above glowing coals. Whoever this man was, he wasn't merely passing through. He lived here. "Who are you?" "My name is Caleb Boone." The name meant nothing to her. "This cabin belonged to Daniel." Caleb nodded once. "Yes, he died here." Another nod. "Yes. Then why are you living in his house?" For the first time, something changed in his expression. Not anger, not guilt, something more like sadness carried for a very long time. The mountain man stepped aside from the doorway. "You should come inside." The cabin felt strangely familiar, despite never having seen it before. Daniel's influence seemed present in every corner. The table near the window, the handmade shelves lining the wall, the stone fireplace built wider than strictly necessary, because Daniel had always believed a fire should be something you could sit beside comfortably. She recognized details her brother had described years earlier in his letters, and mixed among them were signs of Caleb's presence. Additional tools arranged neatly near the door, extra blankets folded on a chair, repairs Daniel never had the chance to make. The room carried the feeling of a place that had endured a difficult winter and come through it because someone had refused to let it fail. Emma placed the letter on the table between them. "What happened to my brother?" Caleb remained silent for several moments. The fire crackled softly inside the stone fireplace, while fading sunlight filtered through the small cabin windows. Outside, the creek continued its steady journey through the valley, as though nothing in the world had changed. "Daniel got sick in December," he finally said. At first it didn't seem serious. The first snow came early that year. By Christmas the pass was already buried. Nobody could leave the valley. Nobody could come in either. Daniel thought it was only a cold. He kept working through it, kept chopping wood, kept hauling water from the creek, said he'd be fine in a few days. A faint smile touched Caleb's face before disappearing. He was stubborn. For the first time since arriving, Emma almost laughed. That sounds like him. He got worse after New Year's. The fever came next. Then the coughing. I moved into the cabin because he couldn't take care of himself anymore. Most days he couldn't even stand. I cooked, hauled water, kept the fire going through the worst nights. His voice remained calm, but there was something beneath it. Not guilt, not regret. Something closer to the exhaustion that remained long after the work itself was finished. I thought he'd recover. I've seen men survive worse. Did he suffer? Emma asked quietly. Caleb looked toward the fireplace before answering. Not as much as you'd think. Toward the end, he was more peaceful than anything else. He paused. He talked about you often. He worried you worked too hard. He worried you didn't eat enough. And he worried you'd never leave town long enough to see the valley. Emma felt something painful rise in her throat. For years she had promised herself she would visit. For years she had found reasons to wait. Now she had arrived too late, and no amount of wishing would change that simple fact. Caleb reached toward a nearby shelf and picked up a small wooden box. Without speaking, he carried it to the table and set it in front of her. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. Her letters, every one she had sent over the years, carefully folded, carefully saved in the order they had arrived. For several seconds she couldn't breathe. He kept all of them? She whispered, every single one. Emma gently touched the top letter. The paper had yellowed with age. Some were nearly 10 years old. Daniel had carried pieces of home with him all the way into the mountains. She suddenly understood how lonely he must have been at times, and how carefully he had hidden it in every letter he sent back. After a while she closed the box and steadied herself. When did he die? February 17th, almost 3 months earlier. 3 months. The world had continued moving, while she remained completely unaware. People had gone to work and come home and gone to sleep, and done it all again the following day. And all the while her brother had already been gone. I buried him on the ridge overlooking the valley. He picked the spot himself years ago. One evening we were watching the sunset from up there. He said if he ever died in these mountains, that's where he wanted to rest. Said the view was worth looking at for a long time. That sounded exactly like something Daniel would say. The thought made her smile despite everything. If he died in February, why are you still here? Caleb looked toward the window. For the first time, he seemed genuinely uncomfortable. I stayed because there was nobody else. The cabin needed maintenance. The roof was damaged during a storm in January and had never been properly fixed. The fence collapsed near the creek. Spring flooding would have ruined half the property if nobody prepared for it. So I stayed, no claim, no excuses, no demand for gratitude. Just a statement of fact delivered the way a man states things when he has spent a long time living with only himself for company. You could have left, yes, but you didn't. No. Then, unexpectedly, Caleb stood and walked to the corner of the cabin and picked up a worn canvas bag. Without a word, he began placing belongings inside. Emma frowned. "What are you doing?" "Leaving. You have the papers. The property belongs to you. It always did after Daniel passed. I can be gone before dark." Emma stared at him. She looked around the cabin. At the repaired roof, the stacked firewood, the maintained fence visible through the window, the stocked pantry. Every sign of survival she had noticed upon arrival existed because of the man now calmly packing his belongings. And suddenly a troubling thought entered her mind. If Caleb left, who was going to show her how any of it worked? The nearest town was days away. The nearest family member was hundreds of miles east. The cabin belonged to her, but she had absolutely no idea how to survive here alone. "Wait," she said. Caleb stopped. "Stay, at least until I learn how things work here." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, without a word, he set the bag down and went back to work. Summer passed slowly, and with a rhythm Emma had not expected to find comforting. The valley needed constant attention, and the work left little room for grief to settle too heavily in any one place. Crops had to be watered, fences required repairs, firewood needed cutting despite the warm weather because mountain winters arrived quickly and without warning, and the settlers who survived longest were the ones who never stopped preparing. Caleb worked without being asked and without being thanked, and apparently without needing either. He was up before she was every morning. By the time Emma came out of the cabin, the water had already been hauled from the creek, and whatever tools were needed for the day had already been collected and laid out, in the order they would be used. She had never met anyone who organized work the way he did. Not efficiently exactly, more like someone who had thought carefully about what needed doing and saw no reason to approach it any other way. She found herself watching him more than she had intended to. The way he moved through tasks, the way he spoke to neighbors. Children in the settlement followed him with a persistence that would have irritated most grown men. Caleb simply accommodated them, handed them small jobs, answered their questions seriously, never made them feel like a burden. One afternoon, Emma finally asked Jacob Mercer the question she had been carrying for weeks. How did his family die? Jacob stopped hammering a board and looked toward the distant mountains for a moment before answering. Fever, almost 10 years ago. They were living near Fort Collins. A sickness moved through the settlements. His wife got sick first, then the little girl. He buried both of them within the same week. After that, he sold everything he owned and disappeared into the mountains. Jacob drove another nail into place. Most people thought he'd never settle anywhere again. Emma found herself staring toward the forest where Caleb was working. For the first time, she understood why everyone in the valley respected him so deeply. Not because he was strong, not because he was capable, because despite everything life had taken from him, he had remained kind. That was not a small thing. She had met plenty of people who had been broken by far less. The summer fire came without warning in late July. For nearly a month, no significant rain had fallen across the valley. Grass turned yellow, small streams shrank, the river ran lower than usual, and everyone, watched the sky with the particular anxiety of people who understood exactly what a dry summer could mean. When smoke appeared, beyond the eastern ridge, Caleb organized the response before anyone else had finished panicking. For 3 exhausting days, the settlers worked almost without rest. Trees were cleared, brush was removed, protective fire breaks were created around homes and barns. The fire finally passed north of the valley after a fortunate shift in the wind, and the danger disappeared almost as suddenly as it had arrived. That evening, the settlement gathered near the river to celebrate surviving. Someone brought a fiddle. Children ran through the grass. As darkness settled across the valley, Emma found herself sitting beside Caleb near the edge of the gathering, watching the river move through the last of the light. "The valley would have lost half its homes without you," she said. Caleb shook his head. "It was everyone's work, but you led it." He didn't answer. The silence between them felt different from the silences that had filled their early weeks together. More comfortable, less like 2 strangers enduring proximity, and more like 2 people who had reached a quiet understanding without ever discussing it. Directly, autumn arrived with clear skies and cold mornings, and the particular industry of a community that understood exactly how little time remained before winter closed everything down again. For Emma, the season brought a strange sense of satisfaction she had not expected. The cabin looked different now than it had when she first arrived. The fences stood straight. The garden had produced more food than she had imagined possible. Firewood filled the storage shed nearly to the roof. For the first time since inheriting the property, she felt proud of what they had accomplished. "What we built." The thought came naturally before she had a chance to examine it, and she let it stay where it landed. She no longer thought of Caleb as a visitor. Without noticing when it happened, he had become part of the daily shape of things. She expected to hear him moving around the property before she was fully awake. She expected his quiet presence at supper, and his steady company during the long evenings when the days grew too short and the nights too cold to do much. Beyond sit beside the fire and let the tiredness settle out of your bones. One evening in late September, she found him repairing a wagon wheel near the barn as the sun descended behind the mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. Emma sat on a nearby fence rail and watched him work for a while without saying anything. "I'm leaving after the first snowfall," he said without looking up. The words struck her harder than she expected. "You've already decided?" He nodded. Emma climbed down from the fence. "When were you planning to tell me?" A shadow of something crossed his face. Regret, perhaps, or the particular discomfort of a man who has made a necessary decision and dislikes the moment of having to say so. "I just did." She turned and walked back toward the cabin before he could see how much the conversation had affected her. That night she barely slept. For months she had convinced herself their arrangement was temporary, practical, 2 people making the best of a difficult situation. Now that temporary suddenly had a date attached to it, and everything felt different. She lay awake listening to the wind come down off the mountains and thought about what the property would feel like without him moving through it every morning. The thought was not comfortable. She spoke with Jacob Mercer at the settlement a few days later. When she described Caleb's decision, the older man sighed in the way of someone who had heard this story before. "He always does that. Leaves before he gets attached. Every time he starts feeling like he belongs somewhere, he moves on." Jacob adjusted his hat. "You already know why." She did. The photograph she had found months earlier. The wife, the daughter, the graves near Fort Collins. Some wounds healed slowly. Others simply changed shape over the years without ever entirely closing. That evening, Emma sat alone on the porch long after dark. Somewhere nearby, she could hear the steady sound of Caleb splitting wood for the final winter preparations. The sound had become so familiar, she had stopped hearing it as a separate thing. Now she heard it clearly and found it almost unbearable. For the first time, she admitted the truth to herself without flinching. She wasn't afraid of spending winter alone. She was afraid of losing him. She loved him, Not because he had saved the property, or because everyone in the valley admired him, because he was kind when nobody was watching, because he had walked through grief that would have destroyed most people, and somehow remained gentle on the other side of it, because somewhere along the way, without either of them planning it or acknowledging it, he had become home. 3 days later, a storm arrived from the north. Snow fell steadily from dawn until evening. Wind swept through the valley and rattled the cabin windows. By nightfall, the world beyond the porch had vanished beneath white drifts. Emma stood beside the window watching the storm. Behind her, Caleb quietly packed his belongings. Stop. The word escaped before she could reconsider. Caleb paused. What? Stop packing. For several seconds, neither moved. The storm howled outside. Emma felt her heart pounding in a way that made careful speech difficult. You don't have to leave. Emma, no, listen to me. She took a step forward. You rebuilt this place. You helped me survive. You helped everyone in this valley survive a fire that should have taken half of it. His expression remained careful and unreadable. That doesn't mean I belong here.
Yes, it does. The answer came more quickly than she intended. Because I want you here. When I arrived, I thought I had lost everything. My brother, the future I had imagined. I came here feeling like someone who had been set adrift and had no idea which direction the shore was. She paused. And then, without either of us deciding it, you became the person I trust most in the world. The person I look for first when something goes wrong. The person the day doesn't feel complete without. The storm continued raging outside. Neither seemed to hear it anymore. If you leave, this place won't feel like home, she said quietly. And I think you already know that. For a long moment, Caleb said nothing. He looked at the canvas bag on the floor, then at her. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. You make it very difficult to leave. A laugh escaped through her tears. Good. For the first time in months, Caleb smiled fully. Not the small, careful smiles she had occasionally caught and filed away. A real smile, warm and unguarded and completely his. The kind she suspected he hadn't worn often in many years. Then he stepped forward, and neither of them looked away, and the storm outside continued, as storms do, entirely indifferent to what happens inside the places people make for themselves. The storm lasted 3 days. When it finally ended, the valley emerged beneath a blanket of untouched snow, and the mountains stood exactly where they had always stood, and nothing seemed different except that everything was. 1 year later, another winter arrived. The homestead had grown. New fencing stretched farther than before. The barn stood larger and sounder. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney into the cold, gray sky. Inside the cabin, warmth filled every room. Emma stood near the window holding a sleeping infant, wrapped in blankets, while outside, Caleb split firewood with the same unhurried steadiness that had characterized everything he did. For a few moments she simply watched him. Then her eyes moved toward the distant ridge, where Daniel rested beneath the mountains he had loved. A quiet smile touched her face. When she first arrived in the valley, she had believed she came there because she had lost her brother. Only later did she understand the fuller truth. She had also come there to find the life that had been waiting for her, without her knowing it. Outside, Caleb looked toward the cabin window and raised one hand. Emma shifted the baby gently and waved back. The mountains stood silent around them, just as they had on the day she first rode through the pass, with a letter in her pocket, and grief in her chest, and no idea what was waiting on the other side of the grief. But now, for the first time in many years, neither of them faced the wilderness alone, and the valley went on as valleys do, holding everything inside it, with the particular patience of places that have seen many winters and expect to see many more.